unacceptable. And Sergio said from that point onward, he decided he would never use the word unacceptable again. You know, that when you're dealing with state power, that you've got to find other ways of actually negotiating with it. In the 90s, I got to know him in Bosnia. That's when sectarian ethnic conflict was erupting. He was in Bosnia, Rwanda, Congo. And then, as you know, in the late 90s, he was the Paul Bremer figure, the viceroy, put in charge of Kosovo in the aftermath of the NATO bombing, and then in charge of East Timor for 2.5 years. Then, when the war on terror, so-called, was all the talk and all the problem that it became, he was the Human Rights Commissioner figuring out what to do about George Bush. Do you denounce him and the violations of international law, or do you try to get in the room? And Sergio's preference, whether it was with Muqtada al-Sadr in Iraq in his final posting, or with the Khmer Rouge, or with any head of state, including George Bush, his preference was always to be in the room. So he was criticized by the human rights community, and I think he saw himself as a kind of Machiavellian idealist, you know, that you had to, in a sense, try to be as savvy, sometimes even as ruthless, as the very states you were trying to contain.
What was it like for Sergio de Mello to go to Iraq when the UN did not support the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and yet the UN, as we heard him say, had to protect civilians?
Great question. Sergio, in this 34-year career of moving to the most violent places in the world, moving with the headlines, had never declined an assignment, never. He always went where he viewed it like almost like military service. And yet, in advance of the decision to appoint a UN envoy to Iraq, he called Kofi Annan's office and talked to his chief of staff and said, "Take me off the list." For one, I want to shore up my job here in Geneva as UN Human Rights Commissioner. I'm mistrusted by the human rights community. I want to win their trust. Going to Iraq is just going to confirm somehow that I'm a stooge of the Americans, which isn't true, but that's what they have in their mind, some of them. But moreover, the Bush administration has spit upon the UN in the run-up to the war in Iraq. They are not serious about international law. They're not serious about the UN. I'm going to go there. It's going to be degrading for the institution. I'm going to be a supplicant to Paul Bremer. He's not ready to take my advice. I've got more than 30 years of dealing with constitution drafting, elections, transitional justice, policing, and he's not going to care. And what Kofi Annan said to himself and then eventually to Sergio is, "You're the best I've got. If we have any hope of actually bringing the United States back to the United Nations, of making the UN relevant." And Kofi Annan was quite insecure because Bush was taunting him and saying, "You're going to become the League of Nations. You're going to become irrelevant. You're not an institution that can live up to the challenges of the 21st century." So Annan had a bit of insecurity about UN relevance, and he thought Sergio was the one person who, just by sheer force of personality, experience, and technical expertise, that he could actually get in the room with Bremer and make Bremer listen to him.
And you mentioned that he spent time in Rwanda, certainly one of the colossal humanitarian failures of our time. Well, what specifically did he do there?
Well, he was actually in Bosnia during the genocide in Rwanda, and I think one of the most jarring experiences for him was to go to Rwanda in the immediate aftermath of the genocide and actually visit one of those UN sites, former UN sites, where peacekeepers had deployed and where civilians, Tutsi civilians, had gravitated, looking at the UN flag and saying, okay, this means protection, but where then, it was in this case the Belgian peacekeepers, received the call from Brussels telling them to leave. And so the civilians who had trusted in the promise of the UN flag, trusted that the UN was in fact the place that the world community parked its ideals, and these Tutsi had not read the fine print that said, actually, the UN is also just a gathering of states who are each motivated by their own self-interest and so forth, and at a moment of crisis, those states are each going to exercise their will in the way that they want. Tutsi hadn't read that small print, so as a result, by trusting in the promise of the UN, they were actually rendered more vulnerable than they had been before. So he was sort of blown away by that. Actually, it was the first time he thought the UN could do more harm than good in places. He was a real UN true believer up to that point. But then he had the really tough job of figuring out what to do with the genocidaires, the people responsible for the genocide who had fled into neighboring Tanzania and neighboring Congo, and who were living among something like 2 million civilians. So there you have a terrible sort of Sophie's choice. Do you turn off the spigot of international life support, so basically to starve out the genocidaires in the hopes that they'll go back and then can be arrested by the Rwandan government, or if the international community was ever serious about making arrests by states in the neighborhood or police? Do you turn off that spigot and thereby jeopardize the lives of the 2 million? or do you keep the spigot of life support on and thus know that the genocidaires are just sharpening their knives to go back and fight another day? And he ended up sort of stalling and trying to do a bit of both and going door to door in the international community and trying to get states to step forward to make arrests of the genocidaire. And again, the system doesn't lie. The same states that didn't do anything when the genocide was being carried out, when 800,000 people were being exterminated, of course, weren't then about to do the right thing about arresting genocidaire in the aftermath of the genocide. And that's the wall that he kept hitting.
President Bush was just in Rwanda. Before that, President Clinton flew in on the tarmac. He apologized to the people of Rwanda. What was Sergio de Mello's response to the United States at the time when Madeleine Albright wouldn't say the word genocide for fear of triggering some kind of international response?
Yeah, I mean, his view was that the UN is only going to be as effective as the most powerful states within the UN are going to make it. And it drove him crazy that people would blame the UN for Rwanda. He'd say, but it was the United States that went to the Security Council and demanded the withdrawal of peacekeepers. It was the Belgian government that demanded the withdrawal of its own, or that ordered the withdrawal of its own peacekeepers. That is, somehow we have to, there's a branding issue here, which is when specific countries do the wrong thing, such as going to war in Iraq or such as allowing the genocide in Rwanda, they are going to take cover, take refuge under the banner of the UN, because the UN is always going to be the symptom of what the states within it do. And it drove him crazy. And so, I mean, part of my hope for this book is that by opening up the system, we will finally sort of divvy responsibility adequately between civil servants. I mean, there are only 9,000 civil servants, UN civil servants, who work, you know, in the Secretariat in New York and in headquarters. The responsibility of those individuals, which can be considerable. And Kofi Annan certainly has some responsibility for not drawing attention to warnings of an imminent genocide in Rwanda. Sergio bears responsibility for different decisions he made in his life. Of course, we all should bear responsibility, but compared to the colossal responsibility of the powerful countries who allow these, who are the ones who have bank accounts.
What was your assessment of President Clinton not doing anything about Rwanda at the time and allowing it to take place?
I was against. I mean, a problem from hell obviously documented sort of just how President Clinton didn't even call